is indeed my honor to introduce our speaker, our keynote speaker of the evening, Dr. Ivory Toldson. I know he does not want me to read his lengthy bio, but I'm going to highlight a few points. And so I'm going to take this point of privilege, brother, to just provide your flowers to you publicly. So not only is Dr. Ivory Toldson the director of the National Director for the Education Initiative and Research with our national organization, the NAACP, but Dr. Toldson has served as the president and CEO of the QEM Network. He is currently a professor of counseling psychology at the Howard University, which is probably, I went to North Carolina Central University, right, which is also an historically black college university. But some people say Howard University is the epitome of HBCUs. But again, I'll let that ride. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education. He was appointed by former President Barack Obama to devise national strategies to sustain and expand federal support to HBCUs as the executive director of the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. He also served as a senior research analyst for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and a contributing education editor for The Root. He's a sought-out speaker, you all. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen him on MSNBC, C-SPAN, CNN, the New York Times, The Root, National Journal, the National Journal, Essence Magazine, BET, you name it, he's everywhere, okay? And in closing, Dr. Toldson was named in 2013 and 14 the Root 100, an annual ranking of the most influential African American leaders. His body of research was featured in the Foundation Center's report, building a beloved community, for his role in shaping sponsored programs for Black male achievement. Dr. Toldson was named the Equity Champion Award, received the Equity Champion Award from the New York City Department of Education, Outstanding Alumni Award from Penn State, Top 25 Forensic Psychology Professor from ForensicColleges.com. And again, the list goes on and on and on and on. But you all, what I want to share with you again on tonight, buckle up. We have in our midst one of the nation's leading scholars, not just in black men achievement, black male achievement, but in African American diaspora, African success. I mean, all sorts of research agendas. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Ivory Toldson to the stage.
All right, good evening. Good evening. Wow, what a spirited introduction. I gotta try to live up to that hype. All right. Thank you all so much for inviting me to share this stage with so many prominent local people and all of you all. There is something special about Eugene. I felt that when I got here around midnight 2 nights ago, got to the airport and I was all fatigued because they had to de-ice the plane in Utah. So I got here about an hour late, got to the airport and saw someone and he said, "I recognize you from a flyer." That don't happen when I go to Atlanta or New York or anywhere like that. And then I was about to organize my Uber ride and Dr. Rasheed called me up. As soon as I land, "I'm waiting for you outside." That don't happen when I go speak in San Diego. And then yesterday I had the pleasure of meeting the president, Dr. Bolger, who took time out of her schedule just to meet with me and make sure that I was accommodated properly at her institution, so I appreciate that so much. And last night I had an authentic Black Oregon experience, and I didn't know there was a Black Oregon experience to be had. I went to a black-owned restaurant called The Library and sat down with two local NAACP presidents. Had Dr. Dorsett, who really laid everything out and gave me a great introduction there, not quite as good as the one he gave tonight. But it's been a very great experience, so thank you all so much. I'm delighted to see so many young people in the audience, and I will try my best not to bore you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done with debunking what I call the BS for bad stats for all the young people, and nothing else. So this is my book right here. It's available on Amazon. On the cover of my book is my son. And the subtitle of my book is Black People Need People Who Believe in Black People Enough Not to Believe Every Bad Thing They Hear About Black People. And the reason why I titled it that is because as I was traveling around trying to promote black male achievement, I found that a lot of people had bought into a narrative that had been shaped by a lot of bad stats that they received. So I started to dig into the origins of a lot of those stats, and I found that most of it was out of context, but a lot of it was completely false. But I want to talk, I'm going to use that context, but I want to talk a lot about education as it is right now, how it's been in the past, and where I think we're going. So let me start off by sharing with you all a letter that my grandfather wrote to Roy Wilkins, who was at the time the president of the NAACP. This letter was written in 1963. As you could see, he used a typewriter, not Microsoft Word. But the content of that letter is very serious, where he talks about all of the atrocities that's happening. He says to Dr. Roy, to Mr. Roy Wilkins, he says, "This is to inform you that while attending the vote meeting Friday night, my wife and daughter were harassed. My life was threatened. My life was threatened to my daughter. They called again, and they told my wife that they were going to kill me and rape her. She was called a B, and they said that they hated me and her because she was black. He said he hated me because I was an old NAACP man. He said that he was speaking for the KKK. They said it sounded like a well-learned white man talking. When I would leave the meeting to answer the phone, they would hang up." And so he goes on to talk about the things that was happening. Now, my grandfather was the president of the NAACP in North Louisiana at the time. He had 9 children. Half of them went to segregated schools. The other half integrated the schools that were around then. So he was right there at the juncture of the segregation era and the desegregation era. Now, interesting thing about my grandfather had 2 grandfathers, and both of them were Civil War veterans. We can trace the origins of one of his grandfathers to a plantation in Kentucky. At that plantation, there was a slave owner who sexually assaulted one of the enslaved Africans, conceived his first child, brought that child to Louisiana without his mother, raised his own child as a slave in his house, then started to have other children. Once he had other children, they went to school, but his son/slave was unable to go to school. But the half-siblings came back and taught their half-brother, who was also their slave, how to read, how to write, and everything else that they were learning in school. So he became an educated person when the Civil War broke out. When the Civil War broke out, he escaped, joined the Union Army, served, returned to Louisiana. Then he had my grandfather. My grandfather had my mother, who was a civil rights activist in her own right, who had me. Now, a lot of people think my story is unique in that I had 2 great-grandfathers who served in the Civil War. But actually, most black people during that time, when they gained their emancipation, had some role to play in our own emancipation, whether it's serving or doing the things that they needed to do during that time. And that's why the teaching of history is so important, so that we know our own contribution and we're not just treated as pedestrians of our own experiences when we're in school. So where are we right now? So I talked about the segregation era. This is pre-1964, pre-Brown versus Board of Education, where you had separate education for black people and white people. Then we moved to the desegregation era. The desegregation era was when there was active steps in order to try to force integration. There was things like busing. There were things like creating magnet programs and different things to entice or force students to learn together. Desegregation efforts failed a lot because of things like white flight, de facto segregation, within school segregation. And so at a certain point, we abandoned the goal of segregation, which was to make desegregation, which was to make all schools integrated, and we moved to where we are right now at this reform era. Now, the reform era pretty much says that it doesn't matter the racial composition of your school as long as all schools are meeting the same standards. It's in the reform era that we get things like closing the achievement gap, standardization of practice, school reform movements, all of these types of things. So the reform movement started probably around the 1990s. It's still with us today. Now, when I talk to people who are in the education space, it seems like one thing that they all agree with is that the reform movement has outlived its usefulness. Maybe at a certain point, there were some aspects of the reform movement that was notable, maybe even progressive, but at this point, a lot of things have changed, and it's time for us to think where we're going. So now we're in the post-reform era. Now, are we actually in the post-reform era? Maybe. Where did the post-reform era come from? I just made it up. I didn't just make it up, but I did make it up. But it's something that I've been writing about and thinking about quite a bit. So throughout this presentation, I want us to try to imagine what the post-reform era could look like. And when we think about where we are right now as a society, when we think about this data revolution, when we think about all of these different changes, so some of the things that's happening now that wasn't happening in the reform movement, one is the white minority is imminent. I'm on the board of trustees of Fielding Graduate College, which is a graduate university in Santa Barbara, California. And somebody on the call said that Fielding is now a majority-minority institution, and we need to talk about that more. That's not anything that we should hide. We should really try to sell that fact. And I wasn't trying to bust his bubble, but I let him know that almost 50% of all universities and colleges across the entire United States is majority-minority right now. Now, underrepresented minorities, that's another story. But in terms of being less than 50% white, it's 47% of all universities right now, all colleges and universities right now. So things are changing. The millennials are the most racially diverse adult population in history. Another thing is globalism. So right now, like it or not, our national borders are becoming a lot more diffuse. We have opportunities to exchange with people all across the world that we didn't before. These illustrations were done by someone in Kenya. I was able to find someone in Kenya by using Upwork and pay them easily, have an easy transaction with them. These are things that wasn't happening before. I remember talking I remember sharing my opinions about standardized tests. And spoiler alert, I think they suck. And we can talk more about that. But somebody who was more pro-standardized tests, we were specifically talking about reading tests and math tests, and she said, you have to understand, we're not just educating them for the United States anymore, we're educating them for a global world. So not just competing against other people from the United States, they're competing with people from China and India and Africa, Nigeria. And so I said, well, why don't we set up systems where they actually learn about Nigeria, China, and India, and be able to communicate with people from China, India, and Nigeria? What does that have to do with a standardized test? So there's a way that we think and process things that's very rigid and narrow-minded, and it's because of the way that we've been learned to conform and accept things as they are. It's this myopia. Dr. King talked about the dream. His I Have a Dream speech is his most famous speech, arguably. In order for us to usher in this post-reform era, it's going to happen in our imagination. It's not going to happen with us just looking at the things as they are right now. So the data revolution is going to be a big part of reimagining education. There's a lot of data that we can have on students. This is a student profile right here. So you have a student profile where the ACT score is a 17, the high school GPA is a 2.7, reading proficiency level is below basic, great school score is one of 10, or 1 out of 10, number of parents in the household is 1, and zip code is the highest crime rate in the city. So there's numeric indicators that can be placed on this student's profile. Now, somebody give me your impression of this student's profile. What are some of the things some thoughts that you may have about a student that has this profile? And just call it out. Mm-hmm. You say he's not trying? Okay. What makes you think that? The low scores? Okay. So the student isn't trying. Anybody else? Not getting the support they need? What about you, young man? They're what? They're not getting a good education? Okay. Mm-hmm. A learning disability? Okay. Latchkey. Overlooked learning disability. Okay, he or she is from a black neighborhood? Okay, because the crime rate is high? That's the reason? I'm just asking. Okay. Any other things about the profile? Not getting enough support. Okay. What makes you think that? Okay. Mm-hmm. Maybe a first-generation American? Okay. Uh-huh.
We all assume that the student is a male, but not really
I know, yeah, that's interesting, huh? Did I say he was male? Uh-huh.
I got some people from our online.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, some say that safety needs are not being met.
Uh-huh.
Others say that he has tons of potential and would benefit from a change of the living environment.
Mm-hmm.
Some also say that he just might be a product of his environment.
Okay, all right. Y'all kind of hard on this guy. All right, you was thinking that? All right. Anybody? Uh-huh. The highest, I think, is a 36. So that the score of 17 places him probably in the 20th percentile. Okay. All right. Anybody suspect that might be me? No? That kid right there. Does he look like me? Uh, I know, they just dragged me. I wasn't expecting that. I've done this before. You all were the harshest I've ever. All right, so let's process this. I may have to restructure my speech a little bit. We need to take a little bit more time than I thought. Okay, so, all right, so I think he came out okay. All right, he did some things that made his mama proud. All right, so I guess I take it that you all may be surprised at certain aspects of his profile when you know that the outcome was a positive outcome. So let me know what surprised you the most and I can help to explain it. Just tell me, just call it out. What surprised you the most? So what about that is the most inconsistent with that? Okay, the reading proficiency. Okay, the reading proficiency is below basic. So has anybody taken, like recently, not as a child, but has anybody taken any practice questions from the NAACP reading assessment? Okay, you have? Okay, all right. So we have one person that has actually taken it. I've taken it as an adult. Now, I can say that if I were to take the entire test even today, I might still score below basic. Now, let me tell you, and you're all like, how does that happen? You're an editor. You wrote all these books. You have more than 100 publications. So the reading test doesn't really measure literacy. It measures a perspective on reading comprehension. It measures deductive reasoning, and it measures your ability to focus and concentrate on one task at a time and not be distracted by anything else. So the practice question that I looked at was a passage about bees. And so it talked about bee culture, beehives, the various different types of bees, the queen bee, all of these types of things. Now, if I'm a child reading this passage, I'm going to be triggered by everything that reminds me of something else. So if I've been stung by a bee, I'm going to think about being stung by a bee when I'm reading. If there was bees at my grandmother's house in Lake Providence, I'm going to think about those bees. And then I'm going to start creating stories from the bees because they're talking about bee culture and all this kind of stuff. So I'm going to start humanizing the bees, and I'm going to think about bees going to school, and I'm going to think about them taking the standardized tests and reading about humans and wondering the same thing. So your creativity, inductive reasoning can interfere with your ability to perform well on those tests. So it was difficult for me to engage in formal education because of that. And when I got to college, I had to have some learning assistance in order to concept map and in order to read differently so I can digest the material without going page by page, line by line, because I need to read the end and know where the book is going before I can really get into the beginning. So I had to do all of that. But the same attribute that made it difficult for me to pass these tests actually made me a better scholar because I was able to be a lot more creative in the way that I used information. And it also enabled me to pay attention to multiple things at the same time. So I did things like design my own book covers and lay out my own pages and all those types of things. So that's an explanation for the reading score. Anything else I should explain? Mm-hmm. We had to take the test because my teachers told me to. So that zip code is the highest crime rate in the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I didn't do anything. The zip code that I lived in had the highest rate in the city. Now, actually, I found out that zip code had the highest crime rate in the city maybe a couple of decades after I graduated from high school. I wasn't sensitive to the fact that I was living in a war zone back then. I thought my neighborhood was really good, and my neighborhood was good. It's a zip code, not a neighborhood, right? Most people who live in high crime areas know that the variance is neighborhood by neighborhood, sometimes almost discrete as block by block. So you know there's a block that you don't walk on. Now, I remember I was speaking in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is my hometown, and this reporter from the Baton Rouge Advocate, which is our largest newspaper, said she wanted to do a story on me because she was tired of writing all of these negative stories about black males, so a black male who did a crime or black male who was a victim of a crime. So she wanted to do a positive story. So I was like, cool, sounds good. So we talked. She came with me to a barber shop. I was getting my hair cut, and she was talking to me while I was getting my hair cut. And she asked me, what was it, and I told her growing up in Glen Oaks, and she said, what was it like growing up in a neighborhood that had so much crime? And I said, well, it didn't have that much crime. I mean, there was, some bad things that happened, and you knew where to go and where not to go, but it just wasn't, that big of a deal to me. And she said, but that zip code has the highest crime rate in the city, so she brought out the stats on me. It's like, okay, I guess I can't fight your stats, but I'm just saying, my mom still lives there, my children still go there for the summer, I can still walk the streets and, So then we started talking about the prison industrial complex, and I told her that some of my friends sold drugs when I was in high school, and a lot of them ended up not doing so well. Some of them were able to make their way back, but I told her that when I worked in the prison system and I saw drug dealers getting more time than child molesters, that didn't sit right with me, because the people that I knew that sold drugs, they wasn't someone that I would think deserved 15 years. They were doing something stupid, but what they were doing wasn't more dangerous than what I was seeing people who wasn't getting hardly any time. So that was my point. Y'all get the point? Okay, because she didn't seem to get it. She was like, so she asked me, she said, so do any of your friends still sell drugs? And I said, no. I'm 30. Drug dealing is a really young profession. You might hit kingpin status at 21 if you stay in that long, but nobody makes it to 30 and you're still selling drugs. You've either been popped out of it, or you went to jail, or you went on and did something more mature. So I told her that. And then the story came out. And it said, Dr. Toldson is doing this, that, and the other, these glowing things. And while some of his friends still sell drugs on the streets, he's a successful professor. I was like, good gracious. All right, so that's highest crime rate in the city. Anything else I should explain?
Well, really two questions. One, were you giving 100% of your effort? And then two, do you think that you are the exception or the rule?
All right, so those are good questions. Was I giving 100% effort? Yes. Was I giving 100% effort to getting good grades? No. All right, I gave 100% effort to the newspaper staff. I resurrected my high school newspaper along with a teacher. The teacher drafted me. I went in begrudging it at first, but that became my life for the last 2 years. I gave 100% effort to reading everything about Black history and culture, which wasn't being assigned to me at school. So to me, finishing the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was not assigned to me in school, was more important than whatever they were assigning to me. So I had to balance learning the things I wanted to learn with the requirements. Now, the college that I wanted to go to was Southern University. You only needed about a 2.0 to get into Southern University at the time. So I wasn't necessarily feeling like I needed these good grades. Nobody was telling me you need to go to this type of college. And I'm still not an advocate of saying you need to go to this type of college. You can go to a community college, you can go to an HBCU, you can go to a four-year institution. Different colleges are different, suited for different people. So, there's that. And also, because of the way that my school was, so I should say that 2.7 made me the second highest ranked male in my class, in my graduating class, out of 300 students. So I kind of felt like I was doing good. I was still like, even though y'all didn't see me as smart, my peers saw me as smart, especially when I was giving my teachers the business for not teaching us our history. So that's the kind of smart that was important to me. So yes, I was given 100% effort. Was I the exception? I was only the exception because the system is messed up. I should not have been the exception. I was the exception because I was able to resist people who judged me based on scores. I was the exception because when I applied to LSU, and I only applied to LSU because I was in charge of hosting a LSU dean at my high school when she came to a visit, this Black woman named Carolyn Collins. And, I really hosted her well. I carried her bags, I opened up doors for her, pulled out her seats, and she thought I was so cute. And she said, "You should apply. I'm gonna give you a waiver, and we also have this bridge program. You'll be great for this bridge program." So I applied. I got in. Kind of surprising. I found out, and then when I got in, I noticed that a lot of the other students had marks that were, a little bit better than mine. And so I had a bit of imposter syndrome at first. And then I found out there was this older white woman at LSU, and she read the recommendation from my guidance counselor, who I didn't really have that much interaction with. But I had to get a letter from my guidance counselor in order to get in this program. And the guidance counselor, she knew about the program, never told me about it, didn't really have that much interaction with her. But she gave me this really good recommendation. And so the woman read the recommendation and says, I want him in, and fought against other people that was looking at scores and said, this young man should be here. So what she was doing was she was looking at data points that was beyond these numbers. She was looking at qualitative information. Now the theme of all of this is that we have to look beyond the numbers and get qualitative information. Now, am I someone who shouldn't have become what I became? and beat the odds, I didn't necessarily beat the odds because I was someone who was leading my newspaper. I was creating stories. I was using a camera. A camera is for the young people. It's not on your phone, and you used to have to put these film strips in it. So before Instagram, before social media, I was making my classmates famous. Like, what you do? Let me put you in the paper. And I was reading books outside of my curriculum. And I remember, and I'll move on after I tell this story. I told y'all I had to spend some time because y'all was like dragging me so bad. I didn't expect to spend this much time. So I got into an argument with my American history teacher. My American history teacher told us that slavery isn't anything that you would ever see today, but back then it was just a way of life. And some slaves had really good relationships with their slave masters. And so I'm sitting there like, what? What'd she say? And I'm like, looking at my peers, class full of black people, white teacher. Wasn't a white person in the class. I'm looking to my right, just absorbing it. Looking to my left, just listening. Just dull, listen. And so I raised my hand, and I said, do you call getting your foot amputated because you're trying to escape, you call that a good relationship? And she said, this is what she said, I still remember today. She said, Ivory, chop, 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 chop. I'm not having that out of you today. So I was like, okay, all right. And so I didn't know what to do with that. And none of my friends were, nobody had my back. I felt alone in the situation. And I'm only 15 years old. And so, I might have been 16. So she walked down the aisle, and I did that. And she tripped. And she was like, I had enough. I was like, oh no, I'm gonna get kicked out of school, I'm gonna get expelled. So she wrote me up, wrote up this pink slip. But she didn't say exactly what I did, which was fortunate. She just said, disrupting the class. So then I went to the assistant principal. So the assistant principal said, I hadn't seen you here before. Southern accent. I haven't seen you here before. White guy, kind of small, scrappy. And I said, yeah. I said, the teacher said something that I really disagreed with. And, I got in my feelings and behaved in ways I shouldn't have behaved because she said some things that really got under my skin. But what did she say? I told her what she said. She said, okay, you know what they call people like you? So I was like, what? She said, critical thinker. I said, oh, okay. Never heard of critical. That was my first time hearing the critical thinker. Said, they call people like you critical thinkers. You thought about going to college? So yeah, I plan to go to college. Good, because they like critical thinkers in college. In high school, not so much. Go back to class. All right, so there's that. So we'll let this play.
From what I know, every Sunday, some black church is telling you this.
Life and death is in the power of the tongue.
Proverbs 18:21.
Can I ask you a question?
So why do all y'all feel the need to
constantly put black boys down?
25% of black boys can't do this.
50% of black boys can't do that.
Why don't you just come clean and say what you mean?
That black boys are no good.
Let me tell all y'all something.
Most black boys don't go to jail.
You won't see most black boys in the 6 o'clock news. Most black boys don't sell drugs.
You know the one that really gets to me? The one that gets under my skin.
All y'all saying that 50% of black boys dropping out of high school.
I got 400 years of the loss of society telling me I'm no good.
But you know what hurts me the most?
Is that my own people tell me that I have a better chance at failing.
And I do succeeding.
I think it's time we start a new conversation.
Black America, you need to know this.
82.1%.
Of black men over the age of 18
have a high school diploma or GED.
674,000.
Black man 18 to 24.
Are enrolled in college.
And we ain't talking about Bible school.
32.3%.
Of black men
18 to 24.
Are in college right now.
Man, that's 1 out of 3.
6.3%.
Of all black men.
Are enrolled in college right now.
Here's the news flash.
The only men that get enrolled in college more than black men is Asian men.
Yeah, please, pretty please stop this.
There are more black men in college than there is in jail.
And for all y'all that saying half of us dropped out of high school, this is the number.
All right, so that came from a promo for a video documentary that I was a part of called Hoodwinked. And it's one of the things that I always stress is that we need to talk to young people about the data that we use to understand them. We don't use the data to understand them without having a conversation with them. We use data to understand. We don't use data to understand people. We use people to understand data. This is a framework that I developed in No BS, which talks about how to use data in a way that we're using it for good and not for bad. I won't go into too much detail with this, but I call it the Du Boisian framework because W.B. Du Bois in 1899, when he constructed the Philadelphia Negro, he devised a new strategy for understanding data, a strategy that we have started to embrace recently, but there was a really far departure from it in the interim. Things we talk about like GIS mapping, we talk about community participatory research. These are things that he was doing back in the 1800s. He lived in the community that he was researching. He went door to door, he color-coded a map. We only do that with technology now, but he was doing that by hand. He also had the radical notion that you needed to incorporate some degree of subjectivity in the research that you're doing. Because if you do research without caring, then it's easy to do research for evil and not good. He famously said, one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes are lynched, murdered, and starved. So in the Du Boisian framework, we need to treat data differently. And I just talked about this, using people to understand data, not data to understand people. A 10th grader wrote this in an essay. He entered an essay contest that I was a judge on, and I quote him even 12 years later, and I quoted him in my Breaking Barriers report, but he said, "What about to be seen as a person with a name, then poof, a statistic, a memory, and too many, a shame." So how do we use data for good and not evil? And how do we go back to this post-reform era? Now, what you see right here are two things that came out around 1968. President Bulger talked about Lane College being founded in 1964. So 4 years later, we had the Kerner Commission report, and we had the Black Panther. Now, the Kerner Commission report was a report that looked at black communities. And the report gave pretty dire predictions about the direction that black communities were headed. And a lot of the Great Society programs, as noble as they are, came from the sense that black communities had some major deficiencies and flaws that needed to be addressed. Black Panther came from someone's imagination. It was, at the time, the most powerful and, more importantly, the smartest, the most intellectually savvy superhero that was around, and that came from the community of Wakanda, a highly technological community that was in Africa. The Black Panther in the comic series went on to battle the Ku Klux Klan, went on to South Africa to fight apartheid. So, but this is all in our imagination. So does it count? Now, 50 years later, there was a reboot of the Black Panther, and then there was number 2 in the series, Wakanda Forever came out. How many of y'all saw that? All right, Wakanda Forever. So I saw the Black Panther at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., in the Oprah Winfrey Theater. Oprah Winfrey gave millions, I'm not sure how much millions, but millions of dollars to this museum, beautiful museum in Washington, D.C. You should go check it out if you go to Washington, D.C. So there's a theater named after her. I went in that theater and saw Ryan Coogler on the panel, the director of the Black Panther movie, along with the costume designer. In the audience were some of the most prominent black people in Washington, D.C., and maybe the nation. And then during that same time, there was a 50-year revisiting of the Kerner Commission report that was published. That 50-year mark, they said that black people made no progress in 50 years. That's what the Kerner Commission report said. So even though we think of this as academic, as an academic exercise, and we think of this as fantasy, the way they were measuring black success wasn't our own measures. It was generated from people outside of our community at its onset, and the reboot was generated by people outside of our community. Most of what we know about ourselves, just like that woman who sat with me in the black barbershop and educated me about how dangerous my own neighborhood was. That's what the Kerner Commission did. And so we're forced to juxtapose our fantasies with this reality that is given to us, not one that we actually have. So if we're talking about reimagining education, it's going to start with our imagination, our dreams, not from stuff like that. So how do we invent a new reality? What's beyond closing the achievement gap? If we really think about it, closing the achievement gap in and of itself is an ignoble exercise and objective. It's something that assumes that one group has to have the measured characteristic of another group in order to achieve. It's a process where you can close a discrete measure and claim success even if that other group is still on top of you. It's comparative, linear, and fixed. What if instead of trying to close the achievement gap, we were just trying to promote achievement? I didn't fit into that box. My achievement looked like that. Most people's achievement looks like that. Most people can use a setback as a setup to something better. Most people's achievement is relative, not comparative. When you try to compare yourself to somebody else, does that ever work out well for you? is when you look at your own strengths, you look at your own objectives, where you've come from and where you're going. It's dynamic, it's complex. What if we reimagine how schools operate? This is the system that we know. And I constructed this on an airplane. I'm going to go back to my reading scores. Somebody with good reading scores can't do this. I mean, not to toot my own horn and sound arrogant or anything. But you can't be too focused, linear, and also complacent and compliant in order to reimagine systems. So right now we have a power structure, and think of this as a school. Think of this as our teachers and our students. And think of this as a central office. And so the central office tries to set standards for everybody to comply with. And so they pass it down to mid-level leadership like principals, who passes it down to students and teachers. And so the ones that are closest to the students are the ones that's furthest away from leadership and decision making. Whether we reconstructed it. And so all the same players here are here. But we shift that leadership from the top to the middle. We rethink the connectivity, and we make the units connected so that we can learn more from them. Leadership, instead of being at the top of this apex, telling people what to do, is in the middle gathering information, understanding the variance in their system. And so you don't really want standards of practice because you don't want everybody doing the same thing. As a researcher, I need variance in order to learn. So the variance among teachers helps us to learn who's the most effective. And so that leader in the middle appreciates that variance, gathers that information, and then puts that information back into the system and shows what they have learned about progress from those who are doing the work. So these are things that happen when we expand our imagination and don't let other people craft our reality. So let me close with this. I saw a documentary series on Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso was a Spanish artist who revolutionized art. He was trained in classical European art. But as a young artist, he felt uninspired by the work that he was doing. Then he came into contact with an artist named Matisse. Matisse had this radical style that looked different than anything that he had ever created. He became enamored with it, so much so that they were at the same art show. Pablo Picasso brought his art in to display it, and then saw Matisse and immediately packed his stuff and went back home. So one of his friends came up to him and showed Picasso this review of Matisse's work by a major publication. And that publication was slamming Matisse, slamming his style. And so the friend said, "You don't want to be like that guy. Look at what they're saying about him." And Picasso said, "I want people like that to say things like that about my work." So he eventually met Matisse. This is a true story. He met Matisse and told him how much he admired his work. And Matisse gave Picasso an African statue. And Matisse said, "You know, European artists are only doing what photographers can now do better. African artists aren't just painting our lives, they're painting our dreams. And so Picasso looked at those contortions, looked at the exaggerated figures, and then he started to modify and adjust his own style into the cubic formula that we know today and became one of the most prolific and prominent artists in history. We have to think the same way about our research as a researcher, and probably any other discipline. We can't copy a primitive, westernized style of research that claims that if you're too close to the subject matter, it compromises your objectivity. We have to call BS our bad stats on that. As I said in my book, soul food didn't come from emulating white cooks. Jazz, rock and roll, and hip hop didn't come from emulating white musicians. And good research on black people is not going to come from emulating white scholars. See, I cook my research in a rusty pot with lots of spice and serve it ostentatiously on 2 turntables and a mixer. You can acquire a taste from my tone and let it offend your useless sensibilities. I'm going to be steadfast in my hustle until you start emulating me. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Good evening, good evening. Good evening. All right. Thank you, Dr. Toldson. My name is Ante Carter. I also work here at Lane Community College in Student Life and Leadership. Oh, there you go. So what we are going to do now is we are going to get into our Q&A. And man, that was wonderful. So thank you very much, brother. Let's give Dr. Toldson another hand of applause. Thank you. All right, so let's see. Being that I'm still waiting on my folks online, how about we start with some people in the audience who may have a question for Dr. Toldson while we still have them. Don't all get up at once, okay.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate your stats up there because I had a 2-parent home, but that was me, and I still, somebody like you was like, you can go to the U of O, and I didn't want to go to the U of O. I actually wanted to come here and drop out, and then came here that's a long story, but I appreciate it. But
they can't hear you on
What do
Zoom.
you suggest we say to educators and people that are working with our youth now so that they can see that kid not decide that, oh, you have a 2.7, forget it, go be a garbage man. Not that garbage men are bad, you just don't need a degree to be a garbage man. So what do you suggest we say to people?
Yeah, so it starts with authenticity and compassion. You just shared your story, I shared mine. A lot of people have stories like us, including the teachers, but they don't want to share that. In order to get their jobs, they went in the interview and they said all of the good things about themselves, none of the bad things. No teacher said that I got suspended when I was in middle school in order to get a job as a teacher. And so there's a lot of fronting in education, just to be blunt. Yeah. We're not honest with each other about the things that we struggled with. And so we lose that ability to connect to our students. And we also forget that students with any type of profile, if they have the right types of nourishment, they can succeed. So that needs to happen. We also need to really change our relationship to the data that we use. And that's what I've been trying to stress with moving to a post-reform movement. I think the reform movement was all about the data, but we used data in a very limited way. And we didn't understand that data fundamentally is information. qualitative information is just as valuable, sometimes more valuable than quantitative information. And so if we train educators to supplement quantitative data with qualitative data and having these conversations, this compassion and authenticity, then we can increase the number of educators that can really connect to the students.
Well said, well said. Okay, so I see we have a few other hands. We're going to try to get to you as quickly as possible. All right, for our brother in the back.
My question is dealing with the society that we're in today. You would be considered and be called woke. And there's a pushback against facts and information to make it where teachers can't teach those things and bring out the information that students need to know. In fact, there's some states actually passing laws to prevent that from happening. It's like, let's go back to sleep. So when you're woke, you're aware of what is around you, but they're making that a negative thing now, whereas being sleep is where they want us to stay because that's the way it's always been. So how do you push back against that?
Yeah, so I don't consider myself woke. I didn't consider myself woke even before they started pushing back against woke. I think woke is kind of an empty label, and they're trying to brand truth as being something that is negative. Now, there's a lot of propaganda out there, and a lot of our education is propagandized. If we're going to be honest, though, sometimes there's an equal opposite effect, where you also have propaganda that happens by people that may seem to be on your side. Some of the people I had to challenge the most about using BS are pro-black activists who like the rise that they got when they would say, we got more work to do when there's more black men in prison than college. They like to say that. They like the rise that they get. And then when I told them that's not true, then all of a sudden I'm asleep. I'm part of the enemy. But the only way to fight the things that's happening is with the truth. And we have to continue to assert what is factual. Not ideology. No ideology should be promoted, but facts should be promoted. It's a fact that black people made slavery untenable, and it wasn't a president freeing the slaves. It's a fact that there were hundreds of black people escaping slavery every single month leading up to the Civil War. Hundreds. Where were these black people going? They were going up north and radicalizing abolitionist movements. They were going to maroon colonies off the coast of Louisiana, Florida, North Carolina. They were leading insurrections. Lincoln said himself that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would. The narrative that we got freed and we didn't free ourselves is propaganda. It's not truth. I'm sure if Great Britain was in charge of our curriculum, they probably would say that they let the United States become independent. We didn't lose the Revolutionary War. We had compassion for this young nation that was trying to start. So we have to fight all the propaganda with truth. And when people try to label, when they try to do woke and all that kind of stuff, we gotta just rise beyond that, because it's not about woke or not being woke. It's about truth and lies.
Thank you, Dr. Toldson. And I really do appreciate how you brought up stats and how they could be inaccurate and what stats they're being based upon. It took me to get to higher education to learn that McGraw-Hill education was based in stats, and that was the only thing I was being fed as a child. So thank you for that. I want to go to one of our questions online, and then we're going to go back to the audience. So this is from Leela Floyd. She says, wow, this is so very relevant for the times we're in right now. I really appreciate the reimagining of data to support restructuring, how we assess possibility, opportunities, and success. Can you provide any other examples for how we start to reimagine in more accessible ways?
No, I gave you all my examples.
All right, Leela, will you?
Nah. No, I mean it's a good question, and I want to, and both of the illustrations I showed you all, reimagining the achievement gap, reimagining the hierarchical structure, there are publications that I've written that those are in. The latter one you could find in a publication that I wrote called Humanistic Distributed Agency, and that was funded by the National Science Foundation. So if you Google my name and Humanistic Distributed Agency, then you will find the report that's in. But I want to make a larger point. It's not about just finding other people to reimagine things, but it's about us really thinking outside of the box when we're thinking about change and not just accepting the reality that we've been fed. Yeah. Because if in the 1980s, there were movies that showed what a video phone might look like. You remember how it looked, right? It looked like a big box analog television with cords coming out of it, plugged into a wall, and one cord going to a headset. And so you have somebody appearing on that screen and you're talking to that person on the headset. In the 1980s, nobody envisioned the video phone was going to be something that would be in our pocket. Now, in order to envision it that way, you have to think beyond just the material reality that you have in front of you. You have to think beyond big box televisions and analog cables. Now we have to think beyond, say, standardized tests. You all wouldn't believe, or maybe you would, but just so many people that just can't think beyond the standardized tests. You're criticizing standardized tests, but if we don't have standardized tests, then what would we use? There's so many things you can use besides standardized tests.
For real.
You can start with a GPA, and then that has some flaws with it too. Mm-hmm. But you also have teacher ratings. You have quality and content of textbooks. You have attendance. You have graduation rates. You have dropout rates. You have the percent of students who are involved in extracurricular activities. You have the number of students that are successfully competing in science fairs. You have the students that have written essays. You have students that are reading books outside of their classroom curriculum. You have students that are in SGA and things like that. So there are so many ways you can determine whether or not a student can achieve besides a doggone test. But you just have to reimagine and think bigger than the tools that have been given to you. There's that saying that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then you treat every problem as if it's a nail. And that's what we're doing.
Agreed. Thank you, brother. Also, shout out to CJ. You're always in our events, so this one's for you. We have a few more questions. I see one over here, and then we'll go to the one in the front.
I appreciate you being here, and that was just incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And as a current student that's still in this reforming system, how can I, try to start this change? How is there anything that I can do to kind of try and get myself out of this system that's still reforming, like what would you suggest to current students?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And just know that most of our major revolutions that's happened, whether it's the civil rights era, the new Negro era, most of them happened because of young people and students. And I think that students have some advantages over adults. Students have more of an investment in the future because you all are going to live longer than us. Not to be so morbid about it. You all also can be more creative because you have had less time on this earth and less exposure to these structures that's teaching you that compliance is the only way for you to succeed. And so that enables you to be able to think a little broader and think bigger. There's a lot of things that is drilled into students that's harmful, and if we could resist against that, like this idea that the best way to succeed in school is to be quiet. We learned that so young. Mm-hmm. Like you can go to elementary schools, what do you need to do to stay out of trouble? Be quiet. That's a problem. We need to amplify our voices, not suppress it. And so, I would say just continue to use your creative genius, amplify your voice, be very intuitive and mindful of things that don't feel right and don't sit well with your spirit. Make a lot of good connections, network. I remember sometime when I was going through some of my toughest times fighting against the system when I was in school, I talked about the people who I knew. I didn't really know these people like talking about, but I knew of them, and so I could say, I'm gonna call such and such. So, just make sure that you have that good sense of right and wrong. Use your natural savvy. I mean, you're here asking these intelligent questions. I have no doubt that you'll be able to change systems as you learn more about it.
Indeed, thank you. Very well put. And thank you, Leela. Also, Leela says that she will look you up. Mm-hmm. All right. So we got two more questions, and then I think we usually end up going over time anyway. We try not to, but we're going to go ahead with the next question. Go ahead, brother.
I just want to say it was a great speech and presentation. I learned a lot. My question is more just right here. Based upon your models, the linear model and the models you came up with, I learned the same way. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, how do you change anything with a Eurocentric model for school and all these systems in America where all mostly nationalities and ethnicities come here and they assimilate, where the African American hasn't been assimilated at all? Mm-hmm. And in the Constitution, we still have the 3/5 clause, which, like I said, we're talking about civil rights, but now the fight is equal rights for different other diversities in this country. So how do you change? I mean, do you think that the Eurocentric model of learning and trying to fit the African American experience into a Eurocentric model is going to be productive?
Yeah. So things are changing, right? It's like the hour hand on the clock. When you watch the hour hand, it doesn't look like it's changing, but it is changing. I wrote an article. I published an article on LinkedIn. And the article was a follow-up to a tweet that I put out. The tweet was, what was that tweet? It was, Lawrence, what was the tweet?
What was the tweet?
You'll get me in trouble.
You remember.
So it's late, y'all. It's late.
We give you that.
So it was a tweet that I wrote that talked about how white researchers can claim authority on black issues while accusing black scholars of being subjective when doing the same research. And so that tweet started trending and was liked and reshared over 15,000 times. So I published an article on LinkedIn that was a follow-up to that tweet. The article on LinkedIn has 36,000 impressions. And basically, I'm talking about changing the Eurocentric model of research in that article. The article is called Needlessly Contentious and Emotionally Loaded. And that was a review that I got from the first peer review publication that I put out there. I wrote an article about black men in the criminal justice system. And I thought it was objective, but the reviewer said that they found it needlessly contentious and emotionally loaded. I was like, good Lord.
Right.
So that was like 20 years ago now. And so I wrote about that experience and my view of why this Eurocentric model of research isn't serving the needs of black people well. Now, that being said, I agree with you that the system needs to change. I also recognize that my ability to assert that the way that I asserted it and the attention that it got is greater now than it would have been 20 years ago when I entered academia, and certainly 20 years before that when people much older than me were entering academia.
Agreed.
And one of the reasons is because we are becoming more diverse than we were. There are more people. I read the article, and I have a PhD in psychology. I read an old article, and there was nine black people with PhDs in psychology. I think this was like in the 1950s or something like that. 9 across the entire nation. So as we become more diverse, there are going to be more opportunities for us. The question is, will so many of us become indoctrinated in the old model that even when we get more power, we will just maintain the same structure? And so that's a serious conversation that we're going to have.
Right on, right on. Okay, so last one. All right. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question, so your lovely model of centered leadership, that's really dynamic, is my dream world. But unfortunately, we live, at least at this institution, on the left at the moment. And I was wondering if you could offer suggestions for faculty who are in those bottom circles with our students, seeing the need for dynamic achievement, but sitting in meetings with people in power who are really pushing forth very formulaic structures like guided pathways. They rely on a lot of those dehumanized bad stats. How we can effectively, being at the bottom of that power structure, push back here and now, right? There's certainly the long-term goals, but in this moment, against some of that really powerful forward movements of those very prescriptive structures in ways that are meaningful and that actually lead us toward the equity that we proclaim that we are trying to work toward.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm, not to be off-putting or anything like that, but I receive that more as a statement than a question, because you're in that position, and it sounds like, just in this brief interaction, that you have the heart to do the right thing, and students need that. And I will say that even in this structure right here, the ones that feel like you can make an impact on some individual students who oftentimes come to a community college like this with faculty members, staff, and administrators that are looking at them as students like people looked at me. And so that's absolutely necessary. But I think that as we start to just understand how structures could benefit from more of a connected model, that we'll start to see some improvements. But right now, the only thing I could say is, the Pollyanna responses of having more open lines of communication and, asserting yourself. And, we have, leadership right here. So, you have this opportunity to be heard and, really, hoping that you achieve the things that you say you want to achieve.
Thank you, thank you. All right, so what we gonna do is, I know we over time. Thank you, Dr. Toldson. We just asked, just bear with us one more. We're gonna close it out with our BSU president. She has a question for you, and this is how we're gonna end the night.
Thank you. My question was kind of answered, but I had a similar experience in school. The teacher in my history class, like, she was talking about the KKK's actions were justified based on their religious practices and beliefs. I said I didn't want to learn from this textbook, and she told me to shut up or get out. So I took my stuff and I left, and I ended up failing that class. So my question is, like, do you have any advice for students who are in similar positions where, like, you know, like, their GPA is at stake, but the context of what they're learning in school is something that they're not comfortable with, or something that they don't want to put their time or effort in because it doesn't resonate with them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're right. I would say a lot of the same things I said to the young woman in the back. But I want to, reemphasize the importance of networking. Students are having that type of experience, and you could feel very isolated. And in addition to our shared experiences with what you had at school, we also have a shared experience in that we have family and a legacy. You all have Honey. My family had the John A. Scott Memorial Fund. So we were raised in systems that gave us that knowledge and also empowered us. And I think back to my peers that sat there and took it. And you probably had peers that sat there and took it. And right. And it's probably because they didn't have support. Who was going to have their back if they took that? Mm-hmm. And so, how did we create that system where I could have these students' backs, and you could have these students' backs, and your mother can have these students' backs? So, that's something that we have to think through. Students like us, we need that support. We need to be able to let the teachers know that, this isn't just going to be in this class. That we have a network, we have a community, and we can fight for justice. And also, we have the NAACP. We have the education chair. So that's what we do also.
All right. Well, thank you all. I'm going to pass it over to Brother Rasheed. And thank you very much, Dr. Toldson. We appreciate you.
All right.
Okay. Wow. First, I want to just thank everybody. Give another round for Dr. Toldson. Great job, per usual. So, just a couple acknowledgments. Definitely want to acknowledge our LCC BSU. Want to acknowledge our Multicultural Center. Want to acknowledge Mr. Evans, the Office of Equity and Inclusion, our administration, Dr. Bolger, and Randy and our squad behind the scene that make us all look so great. Couldn't do it without them. Paula Senna, who's extraordinary, my colleagues and staff members, all of you couldn't be possible without you, and you who took time out of your busy schedule to come here. And I'll be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and thank my lovely wife for helping me tremendously. So give yourselves a round of applause, and thank you. You don't have to go home, but you know what? You got to get out of here. All right.